I became interested in studying how firms report their segments to the public as a result of earlier work I had done on firms' diversification strategies. And it turns out that some of this early research indicated that firms suboptimally diversify and might actually lose value by running a set of businesses instead of having those businesses run as separate firms. The easiest way for investors to learn about that strategy is to read segment data about the different businesses the firms use. So that got me interested in the question of, are managers strategic in the way they report the segments that they operate to the investing public? In the study, Segment Reporting, the Proprietary and Agency Costs of Disclosure, our interest was in what strategic decisions managers might make in deciding whether or not to group different business units into one reported segment as opposed to separately reporting those business units and giving more detailed information to the investing public. And so the main hypothesis that was already prominent in the academic literature is one that's referred to as the proprietary cost hypothesis. The idea there is that even though it is good to tell your shareholders as much as possible, there's also a downside in that when you give more details to your shareholders about all the different businesses that you run, at the same time you're giving more details to your competitors and to other people such as the suppliers of your product or the employees who work for you. So the story there is that if you're really making abnormally high profits in some of your businesses, you'd like to keep that a secret for as long as you could. Because once you clearly tell your competitors that you're making very high profits in a certain business unit, you would expect those competitors to try to enter that business or compete more directly or more effectively with that business so that they could earn some of those profits for themselves. And of course, the result of that would be that these abnormal profits would start to decrease and become more normal over time. We suspected that that was not the only reason that managers might hide information from the public or might group together parts of a business into one reported segment. So we suspected that sometimes the manager would actually want to hide his or her own poor performance. And if they had a business unit that was really being run fairly badly, they would be hesitant to clearly disclose that poor performance to the public. So our other hypothesis was that these poorly performing business units might get grouped into larger business segments rather than being broken out separately. So the main findings in the paper relate back to our two hypotheses about why managers might choose to hide or aggregate business units into the segments that they report to shareholders. One of those hypotheses was this proprietary cost idea, that managers are going to hide highly profitable business units because they want to keep some aspects of that high profitability secret from competitors or suppliers. Traditionally, that hypothesis has actually gotten fairly strong support in previous academic papers. However, in our paper, we actually did not find very strong support for that hypothesis. It is important to emphasize, what we really have is sort of an absence of evidence in favor of that hypothesis. That's not the same thing as evidence of absence. So we failed to find much support for that hypothesis. The other thing we looked at was this agency cost story, that managers might be trying to hide information because it makes them look bad. And we found fairly strong support for that. What we found in our setting was that the business units that were most likely to be hidden were not the highly profitable business units, but rather the low profitability business units. And this was consistent with the idea that managers were trying to aggregate, or in some sense hide, information about areas where their business units were performing much worse than their competitors or than the rest of the firm that they were running. The implications of the findings for the larger community are probably twofold. One group that you could think of the implications for is regulators, and I'll try to turn to that at the end. And another group is just managers of firms. And so actually, for managers of firms, the implications of our findings are probably a bit different than prior research. Prior research suggested that there may be a lot of times where firms don't want to disclose some information to their shareholders because that information seems to have competitive harm. And so it's kept secret even though the shareholders are then a little bit more in the dark. Competitors are also a little bit more in the dark. Now, our findings seem to suggest that that really is not necessarily the way managers make decisions about what to disclose. We seem to find that they are not that concerned about hiding information from their competitors. That might be true for a couple of reasons. There's a lot of reason to suspect that competitors don't rely only on accounting statements to learn about other firms that they compete with. They probably have hired employees from those other firms. They probably have access to studies of the entire industry. And so it may be that managers are not necessarily as concerned as we might think about causing competitive harm when they disclose sort of good news to their shareholders. If that's true, an implication is that managers should be willing to be more forthcoming than they might otherwise be about disclosing good news to shareholders. Maybe the more important implication of our study for managers is we seem to find a lot of evidence of managers hiding bad news from their shareholders. And that suggests that there is some kind of a breakdown in the way that shareholders of the firm have contracted with the top management of the firm to run the business. There's a long history of that in the United States. After the Great Depression, or the stock market crash of the late 20s, the major SEC rules in the U.S. came about in 1933 and 1934 to sort of govern how disclosure has to be conducted in U.S. securities markets. And so there's always a question of how much do the rule makers need to specify versus how much can just be left to private contracting parties. And I think this research seems to indicate that if you are afraid that managers might keep some information hidden because it makes them look bad, it appears then that it's difficult to fully use private contracts to get them to disclose everything. And maybe there is some need for regulators to step in and set rules that kind of dictate or force more disclosure than would happen just in a private setting. And I think to some extent that's maybe the regime that we see operating right now in the U.S. with things like the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. So I think that implication is sort of being brought to bear. A lot of managers don't like that. They feel that these things are overly burdensome, and they're forcing managers to be too risk averse, and they're forcing managers to tell too much information. I guess the implication for managers is if they feel that way, they need to be more forthcoming themselves with some of the bad news if they want to avoid, I think, some of this regulatory burden being put upon them. In thinking about how this question that we researched relates to accounting as opposed to economics or finance, I would actually say it relates to all of them. I mean, in some sense, a lot of accounting questions are interrelated to finance and to applied economics. The particular aspects of this that are most related to accounting are that we're looking at particular accounting rules and how they affect economic behavior and how they affect the way that financial markets interpret a firm's performance. So what we exploited in this paper was the particular accounting rule on how segments of a business get reported to the public. And it turns out that rule changed in the late 1990s. It used to be that firms had to define the segments that they reported in their accounting statements based on industry definitions. Now, it turned out that industry definitions had a lot of flexibility in them. So, for example, IBM always used to just report one segment. They said the only business that we're in is the computer industry, and computers is just one industry, so we're only going to report one segment. That was very inconsistent with the way they really ran their business, because in reality, mainframe computers versus laptop versus desktop computers were all separate business segments, as were consulting services and other things. So in reality, in IBM's own view of how they ran their own business, they really thought of themselves as having roughly 7 segments, even though they only reported one to the public. So what we exploited was a rule change in the late 1990s that said firms are now going to have to start reporting to the public the same way that they make their own decisions internally about resource allocations or about providing bonuses to division managers. And so now the segment reporting in the U.S. is based on this internal structure of the firm, and IBM now does report something like 7 business segments. So really all we did in this study was we took the current segment reporting rule and we took advantage of an accounting idea, which is that you have to restate old years of data when you change your accounting rule. So we could look at how a year that was originally reported by IBM, let's say, as only 1 segment, how would that year have looked if they had reported 7 segments? And that was allowing us to get at the idea of what were they sort of hiding or aggregating and what were they willing to disclose more clearly. So I think it's really an example of using accounting or accounting rules to get at how accounting disclosure works, but also how that ties into the economic and finance decisions of the firm. One piece of current research that's directly related to the paper that we've been talking about is an attempt to dig even further into the details of what firms themselves know internally and how much they choose to report to the investing public. The limitation that we faced in the paper that we've been talking about today is we could only use publicly available segment reporting. So we used fairly modern segment reporting rules to try to learn about what was hidden under an older segment reporting regime. But we were still restricted. All we could observe was the segment reporting that firms actually disclosed to the public under the new rule. In this new paper I'm working on, we've gotten access to data from the U.S. Census Bureau. And for manufacturing firms, the U.S. Census Bureau has data on every plant, every manufacturing plant that the company operates. The census has data on profitability and assets and other accounting information. So what we're doing in that paper is we feel the census data are really the raw, most disaggregated data that you could ever observe about the company. They're probably as disaggregated as what the company itself has in its own internal operating system. So we're trying to build up from that plant level data and see how the plant level data gets aggregated into the segments in the financial reports. So it's really continuing along much the same lines as the paper we've been discussing, but just trying to look at a new data source from the Census Bureau to dig into this a bit further. Other than that, the research I'm working on currently is mostly broadly related to disclosure issues, but there are a couple of different dimensions that I'm looking at. So one study I'm looking at relates to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was very far-reaching and had a lot of impact. People have studied it extensively with regard to U.S. firms, but it turns out that it also affects foreign registrants who choose to cross-list their securities into the U.S. Stock or bond market. And there has not been as much study of how the Sarbanes-Oxley Act has affected these foreign firms who choose to come into the U.S. So we're doing a study where we look at how those firms were affected by the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And a final thing I'm doing is just related to the very broad issue of how to measure the amount of disclosure that a firm does. It's very time-consuming to, say, hand collect all of the press releases that a firm might do and all of the detail that might be in its filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission. So just the need to collect this very detailed information has, I think, slowed down how much research has been done with regard to disclosure questions. And so another project I'm working on tries to come up with a shortcut of measuring the total amount of disclosure that a firm is doing. And the way we're doing that is we're trying to make use of stock prices of firms and find a way of figuring out, can we measure the amount of disclosure that is embedded within the firm's stock price? And can we sort of verify that that measure is a useful way of capturing a firm's overall disclosure strategy?